Hi, everyone, and welcome to Historical Snapshots Conversations. Our guest today is Sasha Vasilyuk, author of Your Presence is Mandatory, a historical fiction novel. The book is long listed for the Center for Fiction First Novel Award and has been translated into 6 languages. In Italy, it became an instant bestseller. A little bit about Sasha. She grew up between Ukraine and Russia before immigrating to the US at the age of 13. She has a BA from UC Berkeley and an MA in journalism from NYU. Her nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times, CNN, Time, Los Angeles Times, Harper's Bazaar, USA Today, KQED, San Francisco Chronicle, The Telegraph, and Narrative. And she has won several writing awards, including the Solas Award. Sasha, welcome. Thank you for coming on to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on Historical Snapshots.
Awesome. Let's get started. Sasha, this is your debut novel. How did it feel? How does it feel?
So my novel came out in April 2024. And now I am entering the stage of things are sort of slowing down. I'm not touring as much as I was in 2024. And I'm kind of in the in-between stage of now what, of writing the next thing and kind of figuring out what to do and how to process the very exciting kind of launch that I experienced. Yeah, it's an odd time you're catching me at.
How was the touring experience? Was it what you expected?
My expectations sort of started low, then went really high, and then my publisher made it sound like my tour is not going to be as big as I thought, and then it became bigger, kind of surprisingly. So it sort of had its own journey. I think the highlight, I toured in the US a little bit. I'm going to Vancouver in February. But I would say the highlight of all of it was being invited to go to Italy on book tour. I was there for 4 days with my husband. I was able to make family vacation out of it, which is always nice. But the way I was treated there was just absolutely, I felt like a total celebrity for 4 days in a country that I love, whose language I speak somewhat randomly. And I feel like it was a once in a lifetime experience. I'm fully prepared for it to never happen again. And if it does, I'll be doubly lucky.
That's amazing. Sounds quite special. So getting into the book, can you give a little scenery to what is the book about so listeners have an understanding of what we'll be talking about?
Yeah, so Your Presence is Mandatory. It is based on a real story, even though it is novel. It is based on a story of my grandfather, who was a Jewish Ukrainian World War II veteran. He, like most veterans really everywhere of that era, didn't ever talk about the war. And there was kind of a presumption in the family that you weren't supposed to ask. And so no one kind of ever did. But there was a myth around the fact that he was a war hero because he spent the entire war. He was there from day one and until the Battle of Berlin, which ended the war in Europe 4 years later in 1945. There were very few people that, as soldiers, survived the entire ordeal. He also happened to be Jewish, which is another layer. All of that created this kind of mythology around it. However, the book follows Yefim, who is this World War II veteran. We meet him at the opening of the book at the very end of his life. He essentially dies in chapter 1 as an old man. And there is a letter that gets discovered by his widow, Nina, that changes entirely what she thought she knew about his time as this war hero. We find out that the story goes back and forth in time, so it kind of has a war and peace structure. Half of the book takes place during the war, where we follow Yefim through pretty kind of incredible adventures. And those adventures begin with him. I don't think it's a huge spoiler, and I think it's important to know that he gets captured by the Germans pretty early on in the book. but manages to survive in many very kind of strange, adventurous ways. That story is interwoven with what I call the peace decades between the end of World War II and the beginning of conflict between Russia and Ukraine that eventually grew into the full-scale invasion that we see today on the news. It's a family saga. It takes place over 70 years, but the central idea is about a veteran who has a secret that he keeps from his family and also his government.
And so, what made you choose this topic?
So, as I said, it's based on a real story, and it really, for me, began when my grandfather died, and we indeed found a letter. It's a confession letter to the KGB that he'd written in the 80s, in which the KGB had discovered clearly that he'd been lying about his military record, and he had to kind of confess what really happened to him instead of what he told he happened to him. When we discovered this letter, it was a huge shock to the family, to kind of all of us, including his wife, who lived with him for over 50 years, my grandmother. And it caused all kinds of very interesting emotions of sort of not just astonishment that you live with somebody and don't know them at all, but also a lot of pity, of shame, of anger at sort of not knowing not just your family history, but also the true history of the country you live in. So it evokes sort of a lot of emotions, and I immediately thought that this is a fascinating story. It is both very adventurous on with the actual things that happened to him. It's very unique. I'd never heard kind of war prisoners and Jews surviving in this way. But I was also fascinated by the psychological aspect of living your entire life and keeping a very traumatic experience secret from everybody in order to, I sort of wanted to answer the question as to why you would do that and what that does to you when you do decide to do that. So I thought it had kind of the potential for a novel because it had a lot of interesting plot, but also a lot of interesting psychology to explore. I'll stop there with that.
How did you go about the research? It seems like, there's a lot on the family side, there's a lot of rich history. How did you go about the research process?
Yeah, so this was the daunting aspect of writing about World War II in general, right? There's a million books written about World War II on the one hand. On the other hand, I realized that I didn't know, having grown up, at least partly, in the former Soviet Union, I knew nothing about prisoners of war. And when I began researching them, I mean, you can Google it, it's very easy. You discover that the numbers were kind of astonishingly huge. Um, and the only thing I knew about prisoners of war is that if your grandfather was one, you were supposed to sort of feel ashamed. And I didn't understand what that feeling is coming from. Like why am I supposed to feel ashamed? I didn't know. I just knew that I was. And so once I began researching this kind of lightly at first, I was very surprised by what I found. And but I must say, so one thing I didn't mention earlier is that this letter, this confession letter that we discovered that my grandfather left, that happened in 2007. I did not start writing the book until 2017, so 10 years later. And I think it's important to explain the reason for that. In 2007, the world around us looked quite different. In Russia, Putin was in power, but there were no sort of active, huge wars directly anywhere near there yet. And I just didn't feel at the time that writing about war was sort of relevant in any way. And that feeling very much changed in 2014 because my family happens to live in the Donbass, which is the eastern portion of Ukraine, and was after Russia kind of stole Crimea from Ukraine, the Donbass became a war zone. in 2014, and it quite directly began in front of my grandparents' apartment in the city of Donetsk. And so, to me, I never imagined that world were like I sort of grew up thinking that World War II was this huge tragedy of the 20th century, but we had essentially left that behind us, kind of as a human race. And as naive as that idea was, it was actually a kind of a Soviet idea that was very much instilled in people. There's a saying, like, everything's fine as long as there's no war. People in the Soviet Union took a lot of shit, for decades from the government, from poverty, etc., communism. But as long as there was no war, things were sort of okay. And you grow up with that idea thinking there will never be another war because we survived such a thing. We learned a lot about it. And then all of a sudden, out of the two places that I happen to grow up in, and I have family in both places, all of a sudden one attacks the other and begins what very much looks like the images that I saw growing up about World War II. In 2016, I went to visit my grandmother in the Donbass, and I sort of experienced, I mean, I wasn't on a battlefield, obviously, but I experienced what kind of war does. And it was such a shock that I immediately thought that book that I had in mind for many years until then is actually very relevant. One thing that I saw while I was there, besides sort of, I heard shelling and there were bullet holes on like literally every surface. Every apartment building had a sign for a bomb shelter. Half the population had left town, including kind of anyone under the age of 50, essentially. It was just a shock to me what happened to a city that was quite booming until then. But one thing I saw that was particularly strange was that I saw a lot of propaganda kind of on the streets of the city. And the propaganda visually looked very Soviet. It looked like you could have been in the 1950s. And so sort of visually, that was very strange, seeing that in the 21st century. But more so than that was the messaging behind it. It was very purposefully evocative of World War II. And the central idea of the messaging was that the West attacked us during World War II, and we won. We kicked their ass. And the West is now attacking us again. And if needed, we will win again. It was said in various ways and shown in various ways, but that was kind of the central messaging. And I thought how strange that is. Like, why would you, there's this new war on, okay, but why would you evoke something that happened so long ago as something that excuses or kind of takes any part in this new conflict? But after seeing that, I realized that they're very linked, these two wars, and that I should write a book that is mainly about my grandfather's experience and my grandmother's experience, but that also links those things and those ideas, those experiences to what's happening today. So the research, sorry, that was a little bit of a long aside, but the research kind of had to take care of multiple questions. One central one was sort of what was the experience of Soviet POWs in World War II? What was the experience of Jewish POWs in World War II? And my grandfather doesn't actually answer the question of kind of the Jewish question of how does one survive when you're captured in Germany and you're clearly Jewish for 4 years. So I had to figure that out, and that was quite a difficult thing to research until I came upon these two Soviet Jewish historians that clearly had the same question and were lucky enough to find survivors and interview them. I think for your listeners, it would be helpful, since this is a historical podcast, to know some numbers. So overall, about 5.7 million Soviet prisoners were captured, or Soviet soldiers were captured during World War II. more than half of them were killed, so 3.2 million people. They were killed on purpose. So while we kind of know generally a decent amount about the Holocaust, this aspect of World War II is considered sort of the least known, the least researched aspect. It was not something that Germany wanted to advertise. It was also not something that Soviet Union was interested in advertising. And because of that, it kind of became this black hole of history. The Jewish experience within that is even less known about, but these two historians found survivors. And the numbers there are also very interesting and sort of shocking. So the Red Army had about 500,000 Jews in it, and during World War II. These numbers are rough, but about 200,000 of them were captured, and only 5,000 of them came back home alive. My grandfather happened to be one of them. The percentage on that, you can probably tell it's 90 something, did not make it. So I thought those numbers are interesting to share. So I had to research those and figure out those questions. Then I also had to figure out kind of the Soviet experience, which was that if you were exposed to the enemy in any way, whether or not you were a POW or an Ostarbeiter, it means Eastern worker in Germany, and these are civilians that were taken off the streets of Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, etc., and carted off to Germany for work. They were often very young, they were often women, and as the war kind of progressed and turned against the German side, they became younger and younger. So by the end, it was 10-year-old girls who were sent to work in Germany. And there were 3 million of these people. So we're also talking very, very big numbers. And and POWs and anybody who was occupied. So let's say all of Ukraine was occupied for 2 years by the Nazis. Those people who lived under occupation, who weren't able to leave, such as my grandmother, for example, they were then, when the war ended, they were all stigmatized. They were stigmatized socially, and they were stigmatized kind of in a very concrete way in their documents. They received a certain kind of a mark that told anybody who would ever come across their documents, such as employers or admissions people at universities, for example, it would tell them that these are second-class citizens, that even if they have good grades, you don't need to admit them in graduate program, or even if they're qualified, you don't need to give them a good job or promote them or whatever. And this mark remained in their record for decades, until basically Soviet Union fell apart. For some, the treatment, was a huge country, so treatment varied, but it constantly was an issue for all of them, for these millions and millions of people. I didn't know any of this when I began researching, and I sort of thought that my grandfather's story is very unique, and in some ways it was. But the more I researched, the more I realized that it is also very reflective of this huge hidden part of history that's pretty shameful.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for sharing the additional background as well. It's helpful to understand. Did you get a sense in the research, why was it like this? Why was it a government decision, or why did Soviet culture respond to the end of the war this way?
So everything at that time was very much top down, kind of like it is today in Russia. Stalin was very paranoid. I think war in general, like I'm seeing it right now with Russia, Ukraine. Paranoia is something that rises up to the top when there's an active war happening. But I think in that time, in 20th century, with Stalin in particular, it was quite strong. And to him, the idea was that as long as so twofold. I would begin with, there was an order he signed at the very beginning of the war because Soviet Union was losing really badly. The German army was moving phenomenally fast through Soviet space and capturing millions of people. This was not how things were supposed to go. Stalin was quite displeased, and the army was moving toward Moscow. So he signed an order that was supposed to kind of force people to not surrender, I guess, or fight harder or whatever. It basically said that if you surrender to the Germans, if you're not fighting till, you should be fighting till death. You should not be surrendering. You should not be surrendering arms. And if you do, we will arrest your family, more or less, to summarize. He was so adamant about this that he actually arrested his son got captured by the Germans, and he arrested his daughter-in-law, kind of as an example to the people. So if you take a person whose strategy it is to kind of act in this way, then I don't think it's particularly surprising that when the war ends, the paranoia doesn't go anywhere, and anybody who's been exposed to so-called the enemy, for a prolonged period of time, which is all of these POWs and people who were occupied and Ostarbeiters, you are going to think that there might be collaborators within them, that people had been turned. One very surprising thing I learned during my research is that a lot of people in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus were actually, at first, very much looking forward to the Germans coming. This is not something that you're taught when you live in the former Soviet space, but when you begin researching, you discover that people who weren't happy with the Soviet regime or with communism, but who also grew up with this idea that Europe is best. Europe is this great place full of musicians and philosophers and writers, and had this idea that they're going to come, that this nation of philosophers and musicians, which were the Germans in their mind, is going to come, rescue them from communism, from Stalin, and turn things around. And we are going to live in this civilized European place and not the backward place that many thought Russia and Ukraine, etc., were. The German army did show up. Everyone realized that this was not a nation of philosophers and poets, and they certainly weren't behaving like ones. And then, the people of Soviet Union turned very much against them for the most part. But there was this idea that, the Germans are going to come. Stalin knew this. Stalin understood that there was a lot of people in his country that were looking forward to Westerners taking over. And he wanted to root those people out and to make everybody loyal. And that idea stayed after the war ended. And to a degree, it is in the DNA of Russia today, of the Russian government, of Putin's government, where we're anti-West. We, on the one hand, kind of embrace the West and all the nice clothes and Apple watches and whatever. On the other hand, ideologically, we're our own thing. We don't want Western influence. And that idea is very much from the time of Stalin and World War II. So it's kind of bizarre that it's still continuing. But, I will not go too much into politics, I suppose, since this is a historical podcast. So let's focus on history.
Yes. And to your point, it's fascinating because you're right. It seems like a lot of this history storytelling isn't well known. And so on your point about the people and their expectations and what their thinking was as the Germans were coming at least towards the Soviet Union, what did that look like then? What did it mean to build an army, or how were people thinking about becoming soldiers at the start? And what did that initial beginnings of war look like on the Soviet Union side?
So I began writing this book before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but in fact, I finished it right before it began. But having watched this active war there now, and sort of its beginning in particular, you might remember how Zelensky was very much fighting this idea that the American intelligence was telling him that there will be an attack, that Putin's going to attack. I remember talking to a journalist who covers the area and has for many years, And he sat in my kitchen 2 days before the full-scale invasion, convincing me that it's not going to happen. I think that idea of an imminent attack, there's a huge army on your border, but they won't dare attack, was exactly how things were in June 1941, where there was a huge army that Hitler had gathered on the border of Soviet Union, and yet Stalin didn't think it would happen. It was just sort of too unfeasible. So on the one hand, he was preparing his soldiers. My grandfather was stationed about an hour east of the border. And on the other hand, he told them, the main order was to not provoke the Germans. The last thing he wanted was for the historical record to say that that Soviet Union started the war. And so they were kind of in this bizarre position where they had to be super careful to not provoke them, and provoking could be many things. And because of that, they were not prepared, kind of even mentally, for the attack to actually begin on the morning of June 21st. And that is, I mean, this is like a hotly debated topic. I'm not a historian. Sort of debated topic of like, why wasn't the Soviet Union ready, even though it was quite clear. But it's not dissimilar to today, where Ukraine was, not ready because nobody really believed it could happen, that Russia would dare to actually attack its neighbor in the 21st century. So it's been interesting to kind of watch the psychological duality of this disbelief that happens. And and then when the attack did happen, things moved really quickly. Hitler's plan was to take over. He thought he could take over Soviet Union in about 4 months. They started in June, so before the cold came, he wanted to be done with the whole thing. And while that worked, while he took France and other places quite quickly, in the Soviet Union, his army got bogged down at some point in the fall. He then realized, okay, this is not going to happen in 4 months, and the temperatures are falling. So one of the things that actually affects the main character of the book and affected my grandfather was this very crucial decision. So they, by November, captured millions of Soviet soldiers, and they were placed in all kinds of camps. I think they took many more than they kind of thought, and nobody was prepared for things to go this way. And they also didn't have any use for them, so they just started killing them. At first, it was with lack of food and with just horrible conditions, like they slept in fields under the rain, for example, very often in huge numbers. And then that wasn't effective enough, that they weren't dying quickly enough. So in many camps, they just began to shoot them, which also actually takes quite a long time. Sorry, this is morbid, but there's a reason gas chambers, I suppose, were invented, and it's an efficiency. They were starting to, they were killing them. And then they were like, wait a minute, we actually need, this war is going to take longer. And all the men in Germany left to fight this war, and we have labor shortages. So why don't we use these prisoners of war as laborers? Ta-da! Except a lot of them by that point, by November, were in pretty bad shape, having lived in these horrible camps. But I think November 7th or 9th or something, there was this decision to take the prisoners of war that were healthy enough to work and send them to work instead of trying to exterminate all of them. Benefited a lot of people who were still alive, including Yefim, the main character of the book.
And Sasha, just real quick, what year are we in now?
This is 1941. So this is just the beginning of the German attack on the Soviet Union.
And either for, what maybe from your grandfather's experience, or from what you learned and wrote into the character Yefim, what did this all look like from the perspective of someone who was Jewish?
Yeah, so that was my main question without which I really couldn't write the book, and it's not something that my grandfather answered in his confession letter to the KGB, because KGB certainly did not care about that question. And I had to figure out how was it possible for somebody who was captured to in Germany at the time to survive. My answers came from other survivors and from these two historians that interviewed them kind of decades later, actually in the 21st century when they were quite old. And I looked for patterns, and there were patterns. So the main tool, and I don't want to spoil the book too much. Hopefully, some readers would be interested in picking it up. But I'll say one of the main tools that people used was changing their name, because obviously Jewish names are a big giveaway, and the records weren't kept very well during a war at the time. So that was kind of the easiest thing to do and the most necessary. So every single one of them changed their last name and often their first name if it sounded kind of Jewish. They either made up names or they took names of somebody that they knew in childhood or somebody Slavic. Some of them also kind of pretended to be Muslim. So essentially, if you're circumcised, you can change your name, but that's, not going to change things too much. And when that question arises, some people pretended that they were like Tatars, Muslim, which is why they were circumcised. And if they were sort of darker and could pass, that worked. So changing their identity and pretending to not be Jewish was one of the main tools. But what I also discovered, and what I found quite shocking, I suppose, was that two things: that the people that often gave up Jews were comrades. So it was other soldiers, it was Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, etc., who would, under these dire circumstances, if they saw that somebody was Jewish and they could get something in return for it from German guards, let's say food, they would be the ones who often would give them up. So for Jewish POWs, that meant that they were not only hiding from the guards who were looking for Jews and commissars and etc., but also from their comrades, which is psychologically just kind of amazing. The level of distrust that you need to have. They were also protected, right? So in the case of Efim, he has a friend, Ivan, who is Slavic, who's Ukrainian. And their friendship is sort of key in the book, because they protect each other in various ways through various kind of tough adventures that they have. The other thing I discovered was that it was sometimes the Germans who would save Jewish POWs or Ostarbeites. And that was also something that was shocking to me as a Soviet, as somebody who grew up in the Soviet Union, because history was taught in a very black and white way to us. It was, Soviet good, enemy bad, basically. Like, there was kind of no, and I think that's how history is taught in many places. There's no gray areas, especially when things concern, especially when you're talking about Nazis, right? Like, there's not a lot of portrayals of like Nazis with a soft spot, sort of. And I didn't want to write a book that does that repeats that, the screaming Nazis and the poor victim of the Allies, because war isn't like that. It is very individual from everything I've read and saw. I wanted to include, Germans who are more complicated than that, and Soviets who are more complicated than that. And the good and bad qualities don't necessarily align with the larger politics. People have their own individual drives and desires and personalities. And I'm seeing, that's another thing I'm seeing kind of play out in real life today, in the war today, where, you're supposed to have sort of a certain politics if you're Ukrainian and if you're Russian, but in reality, things are much, much more fluid if you actually talk to individuals about it. Yeah, and I wanted to write a book that's like that. That's more realistic and more in the gray area of history, I suppose.
Could you actually talk a little bit more about that? Because, as a whole, the Nazi regime was atrocious, did devastating things, caused massive death and destruction. And yet there were some people, to your point, who stepped away from that and tried to save people, or I don't know if it's fair to say tried to be a little bit more humane. What was happening there that shifted the mindset of a person like that to step away from, even if maybe briefly, and act differently?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it sort of borders on philosophical, I would say. Um, so people tended to have, I mean, they lived in a place to which they belonged, right? But that didn't necessarily mean that you were born like believing in whatever the place you were born in believes in as a state. And within Germany, obviously, there were also a lot of Germans who were very much against it. There were communists, for instance. And so I have a character whose parent was a communist, and who was taken by Hitler's regime as well. And so she's German. She's supposed to be kind of a quote unquote the enemy to Efim, but she acts very differently from kind of what we expect of that. On the Soviet side, what I think has been interesting for me and what I think a lot about because of the current conflict was I was brought up on this idea of like brother nations. We live in this happy place called the Soviet Union. It is a union of all these peoples who are, united in their beliefs and whatever. And we're all brothers and we would never hurt each other, things like that. It is an idea that was so pervasive. It's literally like in children's songs and cartoons. It was constantly everywhere. Once you grow up on that, it is very, very traumatic to see one of these brother nations attack another. And I think psychologically, it is that, other than actual destruction of actual cities in Ukraine and whatever, it is that idea that so many people who were born during the Soviet times and were fed this idea are finding so heartbreaking. This disillusionment that no, I guess we're not all one nation, we're not all brotherly, and we as human beings are worse than we thought, or that we were taught. We're capable of a lot more evil than we thought. I think I can sort of relate. I mean, I'm Jewish, I'm Soviet, and yet having spent 4 years writing this book and researching it, I am now I was always really afraid of Germans. Like I grew up on this idea that they're the enemy, they're scary, and I'm 2 generations removed from World War II. And now I've lived in Germany for a year as well, quite a lot of them. Um, and my ideas have changed about how history is presented versus what the reality on the ground is or was at the time. But sorry, getting back to the idea of the Soviet brotherly nation thing, was when I read about the experience of Jewish POWs, general POWs, how much strife there was within this community of Soviet people who were captured. It made me think, this is a theory, but I'm going to state it because I feel like this is an appropriate place to talk about this, is that by then Soviet Union was quite a new place. It was only around for less than 20 years officially by the time World War II began. And these were nations that were brought together under one leadership. But really, if you think about it, what did they have in common? They had nothing in common. They all spoke different languages. A lot of them had very different religions: Jewish, Muslims, Christian, etc. There were tons of languages that were kind of starting to be eradicated by then forcefully. There was a lot of social movement, which is the idea, the central tenet of communism, obviously. So the nobility ran away. The peasants, had their own experience. A lot of people were moving to the city. So there was just this tons of movements, and on the one hand, sort of opportunities for those who didn't have them before, Jews including, for instance, but also just you're bringing together people from like Lithuania or up north, and I don't know, Kazakhstan or something, who's like on the other side of the planet essentially, and forcing them to pretend that that they care about each other. But they really didn't, not after 20 years, certainly. And I think World War II kind of showed me that and opened that up for me, that these people were just thrust together to defend a country that they may not even have believed in against the enemy. And that did not necessarily make them be brothers with each other. They really couldn't care less for somebody from some other part of the Soviet Union. So yeah, that's one of the things I kind of learned that on the one hand shocked me, on the other hand helps maybe kind of explain the war that we're seeing today.
Yeah, there's probably a good podcast to be had on the beginnings of the Soviet Union, because I think we hear it as a term, but what it actually consists of isn't always clear. And it's really interesting to hear your perspective on how it was almost effectively different nations in a way, as you said, being brought together to go fight a war together, but really not necessarily connected to each other. And if I'm using your language correctly, kind of in a brotherly way.
Yeah. I mean, it's not dissimilar to the American experience in some ways, right? There's a lot of states. I remember being in Ireland just as a tourist, standing in line for something, and there was an American family in front of us, and you can tell obviously by the accent. And they turned and they asked us where we're from, and we said we live in San Francisco, and they were horrified. I forget where they were from, but somewhere in the South, I think. They were just they look at us as if we were the enemy, and if we were in a kind of a condition of war in a prisoner camp, let's say, they would have definitely we would be the first that they would sell off for a loaf of bread, frankly. So, I feel like Americans can relate to this. It's a big country, and there's a lot of different people mixed into it. There's a lot of races and languages, and it's kind of big city people, and more provinces and middle of the country people living on farms. Like, that's a very different way to grow up, and you're not necessarily going to like whoever from some other corner of the country. So it's not dissimilar, I would say.
Interesting. So going back to Yefim's story, war ends. What happens next for him?
War ends and he returns home. What he finds there is a shock in many ways. He's been gone for almost 6 years. He began when he was basically a teenager. He was like 18, right? So a lot has changed for him internally as well. He survived, and communication was not great, as you can imagine, at the time. And so there were a lot of cases where somebody was reported missing or dead and then showed up. And because of those cases, a lot of people held a lot of hope for those who were actually dead or disappeared, that they would show up. For years, people held on to that hope. And also what he sees, because he was captured so early, he also kind of sees what the Soviet people have been living through while he was in Germany, and the destruction and all of that. But the main thing that happens, on which kind of the book hangs, is what we learned from the beginning, which is that he chose to hide his experience. Kind of towards the end of the book, we understand why he did it and how he was able to do it. As you read, that's kind of the questions that I wanted for the reader to have in the back of their mind. It's like, we know right away that he kept this whole thing a secret, more or less, and that he's just confessing now that he's dead 70 years later. So what was it that he had to hide? Why did he have to hide it? And how was he able to hide it at the end of it all? And I don't actually have the full answers to those questions in terms of my real grandfather. So obviously I had to fictionalize. And this is why I'm a journalist, but this is why I chose to write this book as fiction, because it really allowed me to go into the psychology of people, which you don't really do in journalism at all, but also fill in the spots where I really didn't have specific answers. And secrecy is something that's a theme throughout the book. Yefim is not the only, he has this big secret that's kind of central to the book, but really every character has secrets. So this is something that I did on purpose and really wanted to explore, because I felt that silence and secrecy became a culture in the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And it was really in the 21st, or kind of maybe in the 90s, when Soviet Union fell apart, but more so even in the 21st century, when a lot of the people of that kind of grandparents' generation began to get really old and die, is often on their deathbeds that secrets from their life in the Soviet Union have been revealed. And so I wanted to kind of imbue that throughout and give all the characters that sense that you're not supposed to say everything. You're supposed to keep things a secret, not only because of the government but also because I don't know about you, but I generally feel like people often everywhere, and not just there, everywhere in America as well, people often keep secrets from people they love to protect the people they love, or at least that is what they tell themselves. We often keep secrets to protect ourselves from the people we love. And so I think in Eufem's case, or in the case of all the characters, really, they do it for one or both of those reasons. And that's just something, it's an idea that I find interesting, and I wanted to explore it.
And so did that exploration reshape your thinking about secrecy or integrity? How did that exploration impact you?
Yeah, it's definitely something that I think a lot more about consciously. I feel like I operated most of my life in a family and in a culture where it is very kind of it was normalized. And so I just kind of never questioned it. I never questioned, why are my parents not telling me key things, or why did my grandparents keep certain things from me? Now that I am a mother, and now that I've thought about this and written about this for years, it's sort of now something that I actively think about. So the main example being, and I wrote about this recently, past year in April, for the New York Times, about my decision and my qualms with talking to my son about the war. Because for us, it's not a war that's just like somewhere far away, but it's a war that very directly affected my family. Most of my family in Ukraine and Russia have been forced to become refugees. Some of them twice, first in 2014 and then in 2022. They are spread all over the place. I had an idea kind of right before the full-scale invasion of going to visit Ukraine and Russia both. And then I had to obviously cancel those plans, and then I had to kind of explain that to my son. I found myself not wanting to talk to him about it. He was, well, sort of the excuse I made in my head was that he was small. Like, why, you know, why does he need to know? It's not like there's bombs here, right? He was 4 at the time, so quite small. But progressively, it became kind of harder to keep it a secret. I was super emotionally disturbed by it. I was crying at nights. I was constantly calling various relatives. And then it also, he happened to be going to a Russian language daycare. And so at some point, he came home and he just asked me, he's like, is there a war in Ukraine? And I was just like, all of this time I was trying to kind of protect him, and making excuses in my head for why it is that I'm not telling him. Oh, he's too young. I don't want to burden him, etc. And then he found out anyway, which is how secrecy often tends to go. And yeah, it just became something that I think more about every time I am either concealing something or avoiding telling something to someone close to me. Do I have a perfect answer for you as to, what's like the moral thing to do? No. But I know that we are forced to make these choices all the time, especially when we're raising humans. And so now I feel like I understand my parents better and why they chose to not tell me. For example, I'll give you a fun example. Well, not a fun example, it's a horrible example. But just very recently, as I was kind of researching, there was one chapter in the book that takes place in the 90s. I was a kid back then. There's a character that's like very, very loosely based on me named Masha. She's the granddaughter. And there was an episode where my actual father had been kidnapped in real life in Moscow and tied to a tree for a couple of days. And afterward, and I wasn't told this. I was, I don't know, 10 or 11 or something. I wasn't told this. And I didn't know about it really. I wouldn't have found out ever, except 15 years after the fact. My dad referred to it because he had forgotten that they never told me, which is the other thing that often happens with time. You forget sort of where you lied or where you didn't. And I was like, wait, what? What are you talking about? And then he told me, and I sort of remembered feeling something. I remember that moment because people were acting in funny ways and they were giving me like bullshit explanations for it. But it was memorable enough that I could feel that something was off. And I feel like that is very often the experience of the recipient of a secret or a lie is that something feels off. Sometimes you kind of, you feel it. So anyway, but I also understand, like, would I, if my husband got kidnapped for 2 days and tied to a tree, and then would I tell my 10-year-old kid? Probably not. So I don't know. I think this experience just kind of expanded my understanding of the human experience overall and why we make these moral choices sometimes.
Understandable, and perfect answers are hard to come by in life. As a final question, how did the research, the writing, the thinking, how did it impact your thoughts of your grandfather?
I feel like I have, it's funny because it's become almost hard. Sometimes I have to think whether or not something that I think happened actually happened or whether or not I made it up. Like it became a bit of a jumble in my head, the reality and fiction, because I just spent so long making up this world, but also imbuing it with a lot of research and firsthand experiences, not just with my grandfather, but with other survivors. And so sometimes I'm like, wait, it's like, was that from real life or did I make that up? So that's kind of an interesting experience. I bet it happens to other writers when you're working with kind of historical fiction or just generally with reality and fiction as well. But in terms of my grandfather, yeah, I have to kind of remember to separate that Yefim is not my actual grandfather. He's a character that came to life in my head. And I now think of him as a real person. But my grandfather could have had very different emotions and different motivations and possibly even different experiences, right? I have no idea whether or not even the confession letter on which main plot points of World War II, part of the book, are based, whether or not they're real. He could have been lying there too, for all I know. And so that's been interesting. I mean, I feel like I immediately felt a lot of empathy for him. I liked the guy. He was a great grandpa to begin with. And then after he passed away and we found the letter, I felt a lot of empathy and sort of pity. But the more I learned about the actual experience, I'm just so baffled that, frankly, like he survived it. And obviously, if he didn't, I wouldn't be here talking to you. And so I guess I guess I feel a lot of gratitude. And I'm lucky that to find out the truth, it saddens me that he felt that he had to hide it for his whole life and that he didn't maybe trust in us and our love for him, that we wouldn't have cared. We wouldn't have felt the shame that he probably felt. We wouldn't have blamed him for being captured, which is what he was taught by kind of Soviet culture that would happen. That our love was way stronger than all of that, kind of historical and cultural BS. I wish he would have told us while he was still alive. I would have asked a lot of questions that I never got to ask. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll leave you with this thought, with the thought that that it's very important to pass on history, because what can happen is that there's kind of two histories really. There's the state version of history, which is passed down to all the textbooks and all that. And then there's the private witness history that sometimes doesn't get passed down. In the case of my grandparents' generation, it didn't get passed down as it should have. We have instead is a state history that is lying, that is made up, that is being used to provoke a new war. And we don't have kind of the real history of people who were actually there to combat it. And so that's the danger. And so I think it's very important, since I'm on this Historical Snapshots podcast, it's very important to pass on the history of your own experience so that future generations have that to rely on, to kind of add to whatever they learn in schools or from the news or from the state.
Well, Sasha, thank you for sharing all your thoughts. It's been an enlightening conversation, and thank you for writing the book and putting it into the world. It's it's a difficult topic. It was a very difficult time period, and so it's great to put that out in the world and have more people better understand it and learn about it. So really do appreciate that. And should we be expecting another historical fiction novel from you sometime soon?
I'm actually working on a more contemporary book that delves into questions of identity, disinformation, and I guess this is maybe a little bit similar to Your Presence is Mandatory, kind of the individual versus the state, and our feelings of nationalism, kind of what they are all about and what can happen to them. Yeah, so it's a bit more of a contemporary. I really didn't want to delve into so much research, although this one requires it as well. But yeah, I'm very fascinated by what's happening in the world and kind of how we got here in the last decade or so.
Very excited for it. And thank you again for coming on to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.